Thank you, Sivia, and thanks everybody for joining us. We're glad to have you here for another Fugue Lunch and Learn, and appreciate the time of Alfonso Cabrera and Matt Stegall for joining us today. We're really excited about this session. Before we get started, just want to point everybody to some cloud security educational resources we have available to you. The first is our Cloud Security Masterclass series. We have a bunch of videos available on demand for you. Most recently, minimizing your blast radius of a cloud breach, including a number of other topics and sessions that we have available to you. We also, earlier this year, released the State of Cloud Security 2021 report, where we surveyed 300 cloud security professionals about the challenges they're seeing, how they're going about solving them. Go ahead and download that for free. And then finally, we just introduced the Engineer's Primer on Cloud and Infrastructure as Code Security, chock full of actionable insights that you can use in your cloud security use case. Now, today, our agenda, we've got Alfonso and Matt here from Red Ventures to dig into a couple of use cases. Really, it's kind of one big use case with a couple different angles. And to kind of introduce them, I want to bring on first my colleague, Josh Stella. Hey, Josh, how are you doing?
Hey, Drew, I'm doing great. And
Awesome.
good to see everyone this afternoon/morning. Yeah, I think this is going to be a fun one.
Absolutely. So, Josh, you've been working a bit with the folks over at Red Ventures, and they've got a use case that is universal to pretty much any enterprise that's operating in the cloud, or any cloud customer operating at scale in the cloud. But their use case is a pretty intense flavor of what everybody, I think, is kind of experiencing. Why don't you go ahead and set this up for everybody?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, I'm super excited that Alfonso and Matt are here, because a lot of times, when we're doing lunch and learns or classes, folks will be asking questions about implementation details, and I'll be alluding to what our customers do or whatever. And it's just great to get a chance to drill in with a team who have done some really remarkable things around cloud security in general and using Fugue. So if you're not familiar with Red Ventures, the New York Times ran a front page piece on them about a month ago, in which they described them as Red Ventures is one of the biggest companies you've probably never heard of. And the scale at which they're operating on cloud is among the largest I've seen, and that's both at my time at AWS as an SA, and also here as the co-founder CEO of Fugue. So Alfonso and Matt, welcome, and thank you for coming. Maybe we can you can introduce yourselves and describe your roles a little bit.
Sure, thanks, Josh. Alfonso Cabrera, Director of Platform Engineering at Red Ventures. I've worked for Red Ventures for a total of 5 years across 2 different stints, and spent some time at AWS in the middle. And I lead a group focused on kind of internal tooling and automation across a couple of different spaces, but one of those is cloud security.
And I'm Matt Stegall. I'm a senior software engineer at RV. I've been at RV for about 3 years now, and about the last year and a half of that has been being sort of the technical lead on our security tooling team with Alfonso.
Awesome, thank you. So one of the really interesting things about if you're not familiar with Red Ventures, these folks own properties like CNET, Bankrate.com, all kinds of, and the guys from RV can tell you more, but all kinds of different web properties, and therefore lots of applications. And one of the really impressive things that we've been along kind of watching and helping this team do is to bring all these very diverse applications into a secure posture. And I wonder if you guys can kind of describe a little bit how that happens. Is it, does RV grow organically? Is there a lot of acquisition? Do you have a lot of diversity in the environments?
Yeah, you may not have heard of Red Ventures, but you've likely heard of some of the brands that Josh mentioned and many others we have. We're kind of a portfolio of different brands. So Healthline, The Points Guy, creditcards.com. We acquired CNET recently as well. So, we have acquired a number of companies, which has brought its own challenges from a cloud security point of view and just general integration point of view. But yeah, we kind of operate decentralized, right, with a lot of different kind of industry groups or focuses internally that almost operate as their own businesses. So that's another challenging aspect of trying to secure all the cloud environments. And then as we've acquired some of these companies, right, they don't, we're primarily using AWS, but not everybody that we've acquired has used AWS, right? So now we have to deal with kind of multi-cloud concerns and onboarding onto GCP and like how do we secure GCP and other cloud providers, right? So lots of challenges.
So this has really been interesting to me because while you're dealing with this huge amount of diversity, and of course, excuse me, when you make an acquisition and you're growing that way, like you mentioned the CNET acquisition, that means that their engineering and security have had a completely different perspective on life before they got to you. So can you describe at a high level or as detailed as you like, what it's like, what the process is like when a new property comes in the door? How do you assess and address those things?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, like, we want to evaluate what tools they have in place for different things, whether it's cloud security posture management or vulnerability scanning or, whatever the case may be. But I think over time, like we want to consolidate to the tooling that we already have in place that work across the entire organization, right? Across all of our brands. And it's really important for us to kind of like, there's this metric almost like mean time to visibility, right? Like how do we get visibility from day one, security visibility? I think that's, where Fugue has come and has helped us get that because it's pretty frictionless to onboard new environments into Fugue. And from day one, right, you can start scanning and give visibility into their security posture across all of their accounts, and whether it's AWS or GCP, right? Because that's the other interesting thing is, ourselves, we have hundreds and hundreds of cloud accounts, right? So it's not like a small problem to solve. We have to figure out how to scale it.
Well, thanks. So what I'm hearing is that you're going to inherit initially some of their tooling and their design decisions, right? There's tooling, and then there's also, the policies of the organization, and they may be different, and so they may not come in the door meeting your policies. I know you've done a fair amount of work on which policies matter to you across the different clouds. Could you talk about that a little bit and how you went about maybe choosing those and then also getting visibility into them?
Yeah, that's another aspect that's very important for us is we kind of have our own internal cloud security standards and policies that we want to adhere to. So being able to have almost custom rules that we check environments against is really critical for us, right? Because then we can work with their engineering and security teams and kind of onboard them to our standards and have them work to get into compliance with those security standards. So we need the flexibility to have custom rules and not just looking at some of the baseline checks, right? Like CIS for AWS or some of these other frameworks, right? We need a little bit more flexibility than that.
Got it. Now in the intro, when you guys introduce yourselves, so another topic that often gets brought up to us, especially when we're doing classes, is where does security fit in the organization, and how does that work in the era of cloud? And I think it's very interesting that Alfonso, your title doesn't have security in it. You're an engineering director, and Matt, you're a developer who is a principal person or the principal person in rolling out these security standards. How does that work in RV? I'm sure you have a compliance team as well. What's the interrelationship between the platform engineering, security, and compliance?
Yep. I think we've seen a lot of success with kind of the DevOps philosophy, right? Where you have software engineers try to automate operations problems and have operations folks learn how to code, right, to automate problems themselves as well. I think we want to kind of have a same principle in the security space, right? Like, can we have software engineers tackle security problems through automation, right? You can't really scale security by just adding more humans. Like at a certain point, you have to really invest in automation. And I think that's where it really helps to have the software engineering skill set brought in to help that, right? As they ramp up in like the problem space, which is cloud security, they can have a huge impact. So we do partner closely with like some of the traditional security functions, right? Like GRC teams and security operations, right? They kind of serve as stakeholders for some of the automation that we go build, right? Because they are kind of consumers of that and customers.
So when we were talking yesterday, you guys described what you're doing as an internal product. And I thought that was just an awesome mentality to have. We've been kind of preaching for years that doing security automation is providing tools internally rather than kind of operating toll booths. Can you talk a little more about? You mentioned some of the stakeholders that you're serving in that model. Can you talk a little more about how you think about that and what you meant by product?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really need to apply kind of product thinking and some of the product principles to be successful long term, right? Like our customer base is our peers essentially, right? Like our technology organization, which is close to 1,000 folks, I think, at this point. So go talk to your customers, right? Like they're going to be on the receiving end of things that need to be remediated or potentially, security tickets or the output of some of the automation we build, right? So like let them have a voice in how they want to receive that work, what they want it to look like, how can we kind of eliminate some of the friction there for them so they know exactly what they need to do, how to do it. They're not kind of grasping for straws like, oh, I got this security ticket, I have no context on this, I don't even know what this means, where do I start, right? Like I think we can be a little bit more friendly in that and really apply product principles, treat them as customers.
I've found in my background before being an entrepreneur was a software developer, programmer, software architect. And I would often hear, and I still often hear, I apologize for the frog in my throat, I'm trying to get past it, but I would often hear that programmers don't care, engineers don't care about security. And my reaction at the time, I was doing a lot of national security stuff. And so I would take a look at the NIST 800 phone book of controls and say, I'm not going to read that. I mean, like I'll read bits of it, but there's no way I'm going to memorize that and keep up with that. So one of the things that we're seeing with policy as code is the potential for security learning to be part of the normal development process, just like a compiler tells me when I'm stupid if I miscast a variable or something, well, hopefully it does. My tooling tells me when I'm wrong. I think now with policy as code and cloud, that's possible in security. I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so I mean, from our side, we try and really help developers take a more iterative approach. So, rather than having the long cycle times of deploying something, they're getting a review later on or finding out way after the fact that, hey, there was this configuration issue, really trying to make sure that we can rapidly, as they're developing and deploying these new services, give them that information and deliver it to them so that they can sort of be proactively push that information that they need to know rather than having to understand all of the best practices all the time, constantly be vigilant on all of them, really helping them focus on what's important.
Well, and I think that's great to hear. That also hopefully, and maybe you have a thought on this, is security is often seen as like, well, I'll put it this way. When I was building systems and I had to go through a CNA process, a certification and accreditation process, I did not look forward to it. I knew that it was going to create a bunch of work and I would have to explain a lot of things. I knew that each time I was going to go through it, I would get different opinions from the people auditing. And I wonder what these new tools and things like policy as code is that getting better as a result of these things?
I would say that as we've gone through the process of figuring out what the standards are for us and what's important, I think having the definitive source of this is how we're measuring this, because I think that at the end of the day, that helps drive a lot of our discussions. What are we measuring, and having that be really objective and well defined, I think is definitely helping give more consistency than just sort of one-off reviews and things like that.
I think like bolting on some of the context in education is really important too, right? Because if you know, software engineer gets a ticket for some security concern, like tell them why they're getting that ticket. Like why does this matter? Like what risk is this introducing? And then give them some ways to like go and solve that, right? Like how would I remediate this, right? Because now they get that ticket, they understand the problem, and now they're more, they're less likely to introduce it in their next feature, as they're developing the rest of the project. I think they kind of internalize that. It's always better to have less tickets.
So it's always better to have less tickets, but it's also nice to have some determinism. In other words, like not just the whim of an auditor telling you what's acceptable or not, but and that kind of brings us back to policy as code, because policy as code is always going to find the same result given the same conditions. It is deterministic, and that means it's predictable. And I love predictability when I'm writing software, because it's, I don't like, being on a moving ground. So you mentioned that you developed a lot of your own custom policies. I know at Fugue, we use Open Policy Agent, and you have some experience with that. Another question we often get is, how hard is it to use Rego, the language of OPA, and to build custom policies? So without trying to bias your answer, what was your experience like doing that?
Sure. So for our custom policies, we've had, I want to say 3 or 4 different folks that have worked on those since we started rolling out Fugue, and none of us have had any experience with Rego or OPA or anything like that beforehand. But by leveraging the endpoint where we can grab some historical data and we can test rules against that historical data as we write them, that's really helped our developers get that feedback as they're writing it and help us develop things. And from the folks that have worked on policies, I've not heard any significant issues.
Well, thanks. Yeah, what Matt's referring to there is as part of Fugue. So when Fugue goes and scans an environment, we build this complete in-memory model of that whole cloud environment, all of the details of the configuration of all the resources, and we keep those forever, or as long as you want us to. So we put an endpoint up that when you're writing policies, you're able to test them against stuff in the past before you start applying them to the present. And this is important because if policy failures result in things like tickets, you don't want to be, while you're refining your policy, you want to have the ability to test and do a feedback loop before you start sending tickets out to folks. So, but that's great to hear that people aren't really struggling with it. I just get this question a lot, especially from kind of investor types. What isn't Rego super hard to learn? I'm like, well, it's a query language. It's not like having to learn an entire general purpose programming language. One of our criteria in selecting OPA, as I think you guys know, we used to write our own language for this stuff with our own compiler and everything else, and we were very pleased to not have to do that anymore when OPA came around. But one of our selection criteria was, or one of the reasons we felt comfortable switching, is we wanted the ability for easy things, simple things, to be really easy, like check a particular port being open should be few lines of code, it should be highly readable code, but that arbitrarily complex things were possible first, that you could do things like look across an entire resource graph, but then by doing the complex thing, turn it into a simple thing to do later in the form of libraries. And we have been pretty satisfied with that. I wonder, have you found any kind of constraints that got in your way in the choice of policy language or the data model in terms of expressing your policies?
I can't think of any sort of hard restrictions that have been that have caused us issues when we've been writing policies. I think we've really been able to accomplish anything we've been able to define ourselves. I mean, there's no restrictions or anything like that, and the docs have always been helpful in terms of being able to quickly find patterns and things like that for how we need to accomplish what we're, or how we can accomplish what we're trying to.
And by the way,
I
folks,
think-
I did not like pre-ask that. I might find something we need to improve, but sorry, Alfonso, I talked over you.
No, I was just say I think the documentation and testing go a long way in that, right? Because it makes it really simple to onboard to writing a policy if you've never written one before in Fugue. So it's you know, it makes the platform really extensible for other security engineers. You know, we have this concept of like embedded security engineers that work kind of embedded in some of these brands. So if they want to write like a custom policy that just targets their, you know, specific set of accounts, like it's very easy to onboard to do that, which has been really nice.
Interesting. Can you describe a little more this concept of the embedded security engineer? What brought you to that, and just tell us a little more about that, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always a need to have somebody closer to the work, right? That will have more context on the specific applications and like a brand or business is building. And they can go a little bit deeper than like the smaller kind of central glue team that focuses on security can do, right? So if they want to do like security assessments specific to an application or run through like the well-architected review, for example, for an application, like you know, they're more hands-on with the business engineers because they're solely focused on that business and helping them out. So we found that to be a successful kind of approach, right? Having this centralized glue team, but then also placing embedded security engineers across many of the key brands.
That makes tons of sense to me. I've always felt that security was a property of building systems much more than it was a kind of separate siloed practice. It's like, you know, as a programmer, I use that term, people say software engineer. I'm old school, I like programmer. But as a programmer, I live within constraints and I understand what the goals are, you know, and very often there are things like cost of goods sold, right? You know, make sure you're efficient, make sure your code runs fast, you know, make sure there's not high latency for the end user. To me, security is just another one of those, like make sure it's safe. And what we're talking about here, you know, it's almost like if you relate it to other forms of engineering, is safety baked into mechanical engineering? Definitely yes. That's why bridges don't fall over. And if we built bridges like we build software, they would. So I love that you guys are taking that approach of really, you know, for years the industry's been saying security has to be baked in up front, but it hasn't generally been. And I think maybe the cloud gives us an opportunity to do that more. Good stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've seen some refreshing of security kind of principles, right? Where like there's this concept of like secure by design, like reference architectures, and I think like, you know, some of the embedded security engineers can help with those things specific to their business teams that they support, right? And they contribute back to like a broader organization. So if someone else is building a similar style application, like there are secure by design patterns that they can follow.
We're definitely seeing out in the market, although you guys are certainly ahead of the curve on this, and it's one of the reasons we were thrilled that you would do this event with us. But we're seeing generally a lot of talk about shift left, which is another way of saying put on developers, you know, put on engineers, these processes. And I know that you know, you guys have been pretty amazing at rolling out automation in the runtime, and to the point where I think it's always interesting to watch from our side because we run this SaaS, and it's like, oh, Red Ventures bought something, they added something, because a whole bunch more stuff is being analyzed, and it'll happen in like an afternoon, which is pretty amazing. But I wonder if you're also thinking about ways those policies can be shared more upstream during code authorship, during like IAC development.
Yeah, definitely. I think like IAC security scanning is kind of like a huge deal, right? Because if you can catch things before they're created, right? Like, security misconfigurations or things along those lines. Like one, you like reduce, having to have a ticket created in the back end and someone having to go do it, and like, or maybe they forget about it or things like that, right? So like you have a much tighter feedback loop of kind of security risk, and it just helps out a ton, right? Because now the developer understands like, okay, I shouldn't do this way because some security risk, right? Like maybe there's a better way to do it. So I think like that is kind of the evolution of this, right? So you talk about shifting security left, like I think that needs to happen like across multiple dimensions, not just IAC scanning, but like how can you scan at dependencies earlier, right? Like we try to catch things with like GitHub status checks, for example. Like when pull requests are created, we'll go and scan for application dependency vulnerabilities and like notify you right there before you even merge the code, right? So I think things like that are really critical.
Yeah, I think the theme, at least to me, is once you have consistency, right? Once you have my dog is here interjecting himself. Hey, man. Once you have consistency and determinism, you can then apply those policies in lots more places in theory. And the sooner you catch things, the better, because back when I was, I've had the I think wisdom to not contribute code directly into our production application. The engineers we have do that. I don't, even with the CTO hat on, I don't do that. But back when I used to do a lot of that, I would much rather catch an error when it was just me catching the error than something falling downstream to where like a team was aware. That's just, I think, a natural human reaction. You want to, it's like you're playing music. You want to make your mistakes during rehearsal, not when you're on stage. So, and I think that may be helpful too, to bridging that kind of gap between security and development, that, it's not a process of being publicly caught out for making errors, I guess.
Yeah, you don't want to come in hot and pointing fingers, right? Or act as kind of a gatekeeper of the output of security scans or things like that. Like, give engineers as much information as they need, right? Context and education, and they'll figure it out, right? And fix whatever they're, fix it moving forward. So they don't have kind of security tickets flowing in as they're working.
Yeah. So you mentioned you have hundreds and hundreds of cloud accounts. Can you give us an idea of how large the platform engineering team as a whole is, and like, if the folks who are watching here, they're trying to learn from you. So any advice on starting to stand up this kind of a practice?
Yeah, on the cloud security automation side, so we have around 5 to 6 folks focused on that centrally, and then we obviously have some of the embedded security engineers. We also have a similar model with like embedded platform engineers with different brands and businesses, so they also kind of help with some of these things, right? But in terms of like security automation and scaling it out, it's about 5 to 6 folks.
That's pretty amazing. You said a little while ago you have probably, I believe, 1,000 developers or something like this. Is that right?
Yep. Lots of engineers.
That is.
But again, it goes to the point of like you can't scale security by adding more humans, right? It doesn't work.
I totally agree with that, but the ratio is pretty stunning there, right?
Yeah,
where 5 folks are providing this kind of insight into all matters security on cloud to 1,000 developers, Mark Andreessen famously said software is eating the world. I think this is like evidence that software insecurity is eating the world, right? The ability for you to do that is pretty stunning, as compared to what it would take manually, and also the latencies I'm sure are much greater manually as well. Hey Drew, do you have any questions for the group here? I feel like I'm completely hogging the time.
No, a couple, and I want to make sure everybody that's attending this, feel free in the chat to, provide any comments or ask any questions that you might have at any time. One, I thought Alfonso and Matt, you two are uniquely qualified to kind of opine on is in general in security, like historically, there's this trade-off between centralization of control and kind of local autonomy. The more you centralize control, the less autonomy teams have. But in talking to you, that's not a trade-off necessarily that needs to be had, that you can kind of establish this central visibility and control when it comes to, say, like the policy framework that Red Ventures kind of applies globally, but that all of your business units kind of have a lot of autonomy with how they operate, and they might have specific kind of local policies or compliance regulations that they need to comply with. Can you talk a little bit about that balance, if you will, between centralization and local autonomy?
Yeah, I think some of the things that work really well centrally is like the automation, right? And like the actual, scanning of resources, whether you're looking for like container image vulnerabilities or, server level vulnerabilities or all types of things, right? Cloud misconfigurations. I think that works well and scales out automated centrally. And I think the other thing is like the reporting, kind of like dashboards or scorecards, right? Like sharing that out by kind of like your business teams or industry groups or tech leaders, giving them the insight into like what is the security risk for their org based on the output of like all these tools that we have that are doing the scanning, right? So they understand like what they need to go tackle and what they need to prioritize to reduce their security risk. I think you need to give, like, that is kind of the other part of this that we haven't really talked about, is that you need to give that visibility and insight to help them drive action with their orgs and businesses as well.
Awesome. We do have a question in the Q&A section. You're free to use the Q&A tool as well in Zoom. The question from Kotha is Red Ventures implementing Fugue for their cloud security implementation? Probably a softball question.
Yes, definitely. We use Fugue for kind of like cloud security posture management, I think is the trendy term. But yeah, it scans all of our cloud accounts across multiple cloud providers.
Okay. But you haven't obviously been using Fugue forever. We haven't been around forever. Before Fugue, before you kind of evaluated and then adopted Fugue, can you talk a little bit about maybe what you were doing before and what kind of challenges you were experiencing before Fugue and adopting Open Policy Agent for policy as code, and what ultimately maybe led you to seek out a tool like Fugue?
Yeah, there are definitely a number of different things we've used and looked at in the past, ranging from like AWS config for certain types of things to like Redlock is another tool we've used in the past. But we also built kind of an internal event-driven system that ingests like our CloudTrail data. So when something happens that we think is a security risk, let's say like somebody, made a S3 bucket public, right, within 15 minutes, which is kind of the CloudTrail delay, like we immediately know that event, know who did it and what account it happened in, and that would trigger automation that we built that would go notify that person via Slack or email or other tickets, for example. So within 15-20 minutes, like they immediately knew that they did something they shouldn't have been done, how to fix it, and then we relied on that for quite a long time before we kind of were looking for something a little bit broader, bigger picture.
I assume with things like AWS config, that's great for, it can work for AWS, but Red Ventures, you have environments in Google Cloud, I assume Azure as well, right?
Yep. It's also with config, like specific to config, it's also just a matter of scale, right? It doesn't necessarily work great at large scale when you have a ton of resources and things changing all throughout the day, because you pay for kind of configuration change, right? And it only tracks a subset of AWS resources.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Yeah, I think we've had, so to be clear, I'm so used to doing these events and these talks where we're just not talking about Fugue at all. We're talking about like topics in the space, and maybe I'm too much in that mode. So for the audience, to be clear, Red Ventures are one of our best and most successful customers, at least we think so. They have brought tons of resources into Fugue management, and I think one of the more impressive events I've ever seen here at Fugue, you know, as CEO of the company, is waking up one morning and seeing hundreds of thousands of cloud resources that weren't there the afternoon before through their automation. And a cloud resource being like an EC2 instance or a virtual private cloud network or something like this. So this is why we wanted these guys on. They're among the best practitioners of these techniques that we've ever seen, and certainly using our tools.
Yeah, and I'll just interject. It kind of ties back to what we talked about, I think, at the beginning, and this is something that, you know, Matt has helped build, right? It's like automation. As soon as we create an account, whether we create it internally or we've acquired a company, and it's kind of day one, like that mean time to visibility, we want that as close to zero as possible, right? Like within minutes, we want to make sure the account is scanned and make sure we'll be scanned moving forward, right? Even before resources are created by the team that's receiving the account.
I love that, because, you know, a lot of times when I'm doing a class or something, I'll be talking about real world hacks. So one of the things that I think is, in my experience, kind of unique to Fugue in the space is we came from a very kind of intelligence community, national security sort of DNA. And what we really care about are adversaries. What we really think about are hackers. And so we analyze breaches, we teach classes on it, but it all gets baked into the product. So we try to eliminate as much security theater from what we build as possible and focus on the pith, on the things that are actually going to prevent these things. And hackers, 90% of hacking plus, you know, whenever somebody says 90%, it's like the vast majority of is discovery. Hackers are learners, they're explorers. And what that means is you have to go there first. You have to have knowledge of the system so that you can become aware of what they might discover. And this is a huge part of security, is having that observability into what's really going on so that you can assess it. And I think this is often lost on folks, where the security mindset has become one, in many cases, more of like checking lists, like, have I done all the things, rather than am I actually stopping the adversaries? So that's exciting to hear from you. So when you have that many accounts, and I know you guys have been with us for quite a while, so you predate our whole multi-tenant capability that we've added. But when you're talking about that scale, what are some of the things that, let's say there are some folks in the audience here who are just really embarking on this automation path. How would you advise them to go from just starting to, I mean, the scale you guys are at? What's the journey look like there?
So for us, I think when we were just starting and just trying to get a gauge on the platform, we definitely started with a small scale deployment of just, you know, a few accounts, wanting to check out you know, how the platform worked and things like that. But once we committed to it, we basically decided on what our default configuration was going to be and how we wanted to sort of roll this out across the board. And so we looked at the policies that we wanted to implement, or the families that we wanted to make sure were enabled and things like that. And then we basically automated it so that we could basically with a single API call go and set up in a single environment based on how we wanted it configured. And then over the course of, I believe it was like a day or so, when we decided to roll everything out, rolled out to several hundred AWS accounts just by looking at our inventory of what we're looking at or what we've got that we want to start measuring. And then sort of like Alfonso was saying, making sure that we're tracking changes and things like that to make sure that we continue to have full coverage. And then once we had it rolled out, we just had to figure out how we wanted to get folks access because part of it is getting the engineers to actually be able to see the information. It's great if we can see it, but it's even better if the engineers can go and directly look at the health of their accounts. So then we started to dig into how we wanted to give access and being able to do things like creating groups of accounts that the engineers might need. And this is where the multi-tenancy might start to change things or make things a little bit different from how we originally did it. But basically figuring out access groups and how we wanted to let engineers request those permissions as they needed them. And that's been the journey in terms of actually rolling out Fugue. And then there's also been other things as to how it ties into the rest of our ecosystem.
And I'd add, like in general, like you don't really need to get hung up on, making sure you have your own internal security standards or policies. Like that is obviously nice to have and important part of like maturing your security program, but it's not as important as like having visibility from day one, right? And like that's one of the nice things about the platform is it's very painless to onboard Fugue, right, and to give visibility into like your cloud environments. And you can rely on like some of the default checks, right? Some of the default kind of compliance families. You can start with like CIS for AWS. You can start with Fugue best practices. Like that will cover a lot of ground for you while you focus on maturing kind of other aspects. But nothing kind of trumps like having that level of visibility from the get-go and baseline.
That is so satisfying to hear because I mean, as you know, we've spent a lot of time on visibility in general. We're big believers that our customers, we're going to help you assess your security posture and whether or not you're vulnerable, but ultimately your systems. And so the most important thing is for us to, or one of the most important things is for us to help you kind of see the whole picture. And so if you're not familiar, those out there listening, we've spent a lot of time and energy building a visualizer that allows you to like see network graphs. I wonder if that functionality, the hypothesis behind that was that just lists of stuff are hard for humans to grok, but maps are pretty good. I wonder, I haven't asked you this before, so I'm treading on thin ice here, but has that been helpful?
I've definitely found it helpful personally as an engineer to be able to go and just get the sort of visual overview of our environment, but also to when you're going into new environments. So maybe helping someone else out with something in their account or something like that. It's really great for being able to get that 10,000 foot overview of what's going on in this account without having to go and find the right documentation or right person to talk to. It's great for that.
Well, that's good to hear. We continue to work on it at all times. Hey, Drew, do you have any other questions from the crowd? I see a few in Q&A. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. We have one in Q&A here. Azure has policies for security. How does Fugue help on top of Azure Policies? And I'm not too familiar with the Azure Policies capability. I don't know if Matt or Alfonso you can speak to that.
If not, I am. So
yeah, take over, Josh. We don't use Azure much.
So Azure policies are, first of all, the Azure security stuff is pretty good. You know, and I mean that in like from a programmer perspective. If I say it's pretty good, I respect it. So Azure policies are really about limiting the ability to make particular API calls, et cetera, at, you know, the time of the call. What Fugue does is quite different than that. What we're going to do, and we don't do that. In fact, only CSPs can do really what Azure policies do. And obviously we're not Microsoft. So what we're going to do is tell you so there's this kind of very simplified view of the world that if I just restrict certain actions and functions on individual resources, I'll be safe. That is not true in cloud security. That is what the press often focus on, like the famous, oh, it was an S3 bucket that was left public. Well, we'll go read the DOJ filings and find out, actually, that's not what it was. The hacker eventually got to S3. I'm using an AWS example, but same with Azure. But they did it through a complex chain of configuration hacks. It wasn't just left wide open. So what Azure Policy is going to be great at is limiting what different principles can do from an API perspective. What Fugue is going to tell you is your architecture safe? Do you have a design that is introducing risk or not? So I'll give one brief example of. So these are complementary. In fact, what some of our Azure-centric customers do is use Fugue to make sure Azure Policy is in use in the appropriate way, because we just view that as a configuration item, right? So these are complementary techniques. The kinds of things we'll catch that things like that can't prevent are, do you have a compute instance of any sort, a virtual machine or a container that has API list permissions to object storage? And there are object stores with sensitive data. That combination is actually incredibly dangerous. Any one of those things is fine, right? But you need them all together to get the Capital One breach, for example. So so kind of different problems that we're solving.
Great. I have a question. I love the mean time to visibility kind of metric, Alfonso, that you speak to often. You know, Red Ventures has been using Fugue for quite a while. So I wanted to see if you could kind of reach back in your memory as to like what was done, you know, quite some time in the past, or maybe use your awareness of some other tooling that's out there, processes that are out there, and kind of come up with a ROI, I guess, of Fugue sort of. And I'd add to that too, what's interesting about Red Ventures is you continue to experience a rapid mean time to visibility because you continue to ingest new environments all the time into your security posture. What might that look like in a non-Fugue world for you? Like, how would you go about getting that visibility? What might that mean time to visibility look like with other tools or processes out there?
It's definitely a painful process, right? Like when you don't have a tool like Fugue or something similar, and you're having to, like, you inherit an account, you're having to kind of piece together like what's in the account, right? You can cobble some things together by looking at different AWS services, for example, but you're likely going to miss something, right? Or like you're not going to fully understand the big picture of like what is the kind of like aggregate risk of this account. So you really need something to give you that visibility, and ideally as quickly as possible. So I think the ROI has been huge for us in that regard, right? As we continue to like acquire a number of companies in the past years, and even just internally just create a lot of new accounts, right? We kind of have we try to limit the blast radius, right? So we spin up accounts frequently for different kind of projects and applications. So it's been huge for us.
Yeah, awesome. And maybe to follow up on that, you know, with using OPA for policy as code, like what, you know, how we're policies expressed before? Was it, written in English in a binder that everybody kind of had to like manually sort of apply to things that they're reviewing, or, what is Open Policy Agent been able to enable for you?
Yeah, I think if you don't have something like that, right, and you have kind of like standards that you want to check for compliance with, like it's just a never ending game, right? Like you're never going to keep up. So it kind of turns into this thing of like, oh yeah, we have these standards that we're supposed to adhere to, but like nobody really checks them because it's hard to do so manually, right? Or you have to write some like custom scripts to go do it, and it's just not an area where you really want to invest engineering resources, compared to having something a little bit more, as Josh said, like deterministic and something that allows you to scale better, not only on the backend scanning, but also like at the IAC level.
Great. We do have a question in the Q&A that I love because it enables us to hit on the third use case that we talked about, which is some integrations. Do you use Fugue to create alerts?
Yes, so we have a system that we've built out in-house that we use across a few different security vendors, and Fugue is one of the systems that we tie into that. And the sort of the goal of that system is to make sure that as we have these findings and as we become aware of things, that we can distribute that work to the people that can actually make the changes and help fix them. So what we've done is we've taken that Fugue notification system where we can get any compliance changes across all of our environments, and we can feed that into our system, which can look at what account or what project it's going into, look at some information that we have about that account in one of our other systems in terms of who owns it, who's responsible, that sort of thing, and make sure that we get that information to them, whether it's in the form or mostly in the form of a ticket, just so that we can sort of track that work once we're aware of it.
Yeah, we have some metadata kind of around our cloud accounts, and one of those things is kind of like an account owner tag. So like who is kind of ultimately responsible for this account, or a group of people, right? It can be more than one in many cases. And also like who is the leader associated with this account. So like what business does this account roll up to? Because that helps on the like backend reporting and visualization thing, some of those things we talked about earlier. But it also helps with like assignee mapping, like who should get this ticket, like who's going to know like what to do with this and take action. So we take the output of Fugue, ingest it into kind of our internal system, and then enrich it with some data from like a CMDB for some of the metadata.
So one of the sort of design principles that we built on was we had the expectation that, okay, so to rewind, when you're automating things, you first have to know what you want to automate, right? That sounds like pedantry, but very often people want to like jump straight to automation, but they haven't really thought through exactly what should be automated. And I think what we've tried to do is make Fugue initially, and this is really for the audience, we guarantee that in 15 minutes, we will give you visibility across 3 global cloud accounts. Were designed to be initially very manually frictionless. So you can go in and very graphical. You can go in and see where you are really quickly. We're also designed that, and there's a process to that, right? So when you first go in and start examining things, Fugue is going to inform you, hopefully. I think generally that's been true, of what you might be concerned about and where you might have issues. Very often when folks first onboard into Fugue, they discover what we call orphaned infrastructure, things that are forgotten about. And by the way, that is very often the initial attack vector for adversaries, for hackers, stuff you've forgotten about. So they'll go in and do discovery for a time, and they'll start to learn, what they care about most. And that's where the automation through the APIs comes in, is scaling that. Was your journey kind of like that, or were you already clear on what you wanted to automate?
I think there was definitely some initial discovery as we as we started, just getting into the tool. But I think we, at least by the time I was getting involved with the project, had a pretty clear idea of what we wanted to accomplish at that point with the tool. Although it has definitely continued to grow and evolve over time as we, discuss new standards or things like that. How we use the tool has definitely changed, but I think when we did that big rollout, we had some idea. We had a pretty good idea of what we were trying to get out of it.
Got it. So Civi is prompting us here. We have just 3 minutes left, and do we want to answer the remaining questions? I'll just jump into these 3 questions.
We have one here that might be for Josh. Does Fugue show any events when someone has done, like, create a user, or is Fugue limited to seeing how accounts are configured?
Fugue will see when IAM changes are made. So one of the things we do is, regardless of policy, we keep track of everything that's added, everything that's removed, and everything that is mutated, everything that's modified. So the short answer to that is kind of yes to both. Yes, we will keep track of when things like creating IAM or resources, and yes, we do focus on account configuration, but those things actually are closely related.
Okay, and I cannot see chat any longer or the Q&A box because I've got the screen share up. So let me know, Josh, if any more have come in.
Yeah, so I'll just answer a couple here real quick. So Keith asks, so do you have Fugue scan every 15 minutes? You can scan as frequently as you want, but you do need to take into consideration the account and region API throttles for different services. It's a black art knowing what AWS and the other providers are gonna ding you for in terms of number of API calls. We can help with that. We can certainly do 15 minutes. I think the fastest we have running right now is like 5 or 6 minutes for a set of resources. For
one of the nice things too, I'll just jump in there. One of the nice things is, like, you can have a different set of scan intervals for different accounts. Like if you don't care as much about sandbox environments or development environments and you want to scan them once a day or something like that, you can do that. But you can scan production every 15 minutes, right, or sooner,
or
so
on demand.
Or on demand. So there's a lot of flexibility to how you approach it.
Yeah, I mean, the on-demand thing is actually worth bringing up because a lot of the competitors, and one of the other questions is about competitors, you really can't. At any time, you can tell Fugue, go scan a thing. And that's really important for things like CI/CD integration. Somebody, the question's gone, but somebody said, I hope Fugue is a SaaS. We are 100% SaaS. Nothing to install, no agents. We do have some tools for IAC that you can download binaries for and run locally, but Fugue as a CSPM, as a cloud security tool, is 100% SaaS. Who are our competitors? Well, if you read websites, there are tons of them, right? But in practice, there are a handful. There are a lot of people claiming to do the kinds of things we do, but very few of them have focused as deeply on it. Obviously, Palo Alto Networks has spent a great deal of money buying a bunch of companies to compete in our space. Who else? I guess Rapid7 we sometimes run into. Checkpoint we sometimes run into. But mostly the market is still kind of greenfield. So a lot of folks just haven't done this yet. How does Fugue, Kota asks, how does Fugue integrate with Azure, AWS, GCP? It's very simple. You just need to open up some credentials from your side to give us some read abilities. We will walk you through that whole process in an automated way, and it can be done in just a few minutes. So I think we're officially over. Sorry about that. Drew, Sivia, anything else to take us out?
No, I just again want to thank everybody for joining us today, and definitely thank you to Matt and Alfonso for taking the time to join us and talk a little bit about your experience with Fugue over at Red Ventures. Super interesting and incredibly challenging sounding use case you have with all the different business units coming on board and all the environments they bring. Unique security challenges. So thank you, both of you, for this time. We really appreciate it. And if anybody out there wants to connect with Fugue to kind of dig in a little bit on how Fugue might help you with your unique cloud security use case and challenges, connect with our solutions team. You can reach out directly to Tyler Mills at tyler.mills@fugue.co, and we'll set something up. And otherwise, again, thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate it. Until next time, we'll see you later.
Thanks,